Like grab that.
That was get away from me.
Man, one more.
There's no way for us to that work.
Oh, and the betting thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I used to double yours on that account, and I hit last night. No, that's okay. Because you got 25 in there, right? 25 in there. Yes, I dub. Because
We'll go ahead and start here with the last session of our meeting. What we intend to do now is wrap up in two ways, really. We're going to ask Robert Hunt, whose background I'll explain to you in a minute, and Brett Scharf's, likewise, I'll talk about his background, to help us understand the importance of what we're all about here, what it means to our society, and to our God. And they'll each have a presentation they'd like to give, after which we'll probably have a brief period of time for some Q&A. And then our concluding speaker will be Thomas Griffith, who I will also introduce at that point in time. And then I'll make some closing remarks. So with that, Brett, would you like to go first? Share your thoughts. Can I do that now, or is it too late? Okay, so thank you. Appreciate that, Robert. So, and I'll introduce these two people more as my friends than just for what they've accomplished in life. These are two men that I just admire tremendously. Brett is a professor at BYU and really one of the founders of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies. And as we have our summit here, Brett is basically sponsoring and holding about, I don't know, Brett, what, 15 or 20 a year of these conferences in capitals of the world, all over the world, not just the Christian world. And they have also set up professorships and endowed chairs at various universities, Oxford in particular, believe it or not, in Shanghai and elsewhere. Brett is just a tremendous, not just advocate and proponent, but a tremendous scholar in the area of religious freedom around the world. So he'll be our first speaker. And Brett, I guess, let me just do a couple other things up here. You're also on the advisory board at Oxford, their Journal of Religion, at the University of Adelaide, Australia, and so forth. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much. It's really an honor for me to be here. I'm so proud of Bill Bennick and Mark Romney and the entire Dallas-Fort Worth Religious Freedom Alliance team for persisting in putting these really excellent programs together. I'd like to thank everyone who's here supporting them and their effort. I want to also specifically mention Pastor Bob Roberts, who moderated our lunch discussion. He's been just a tremendous force for good in this community and in support of the Religious Freedom Alliance. And I'm honored to share the podium today with Robert Hunt, who has, I think, been Bill's co-conspirator from the very beginning. And I don't think there's anyone that's more important to the hospitality we receive here at SMU and the beautiful venue we have to meet in than Professor Hunt. So thank you very much, Professor Hunt. It's my pleasure to be here with you. I'm really grateful for the metaphor we have of lowering the temperature. There is so much heat and sometimes not as much light when it comes to important cultural issues that we confront today. I've written about confronting hate speech, and one of the things we find about hate speech is it's often not the hate speech which triggers violence. It is the audience of the hate speech. You get the Danish cartoons followed by imams that are reacting in a very strong way, and soon you have demonstrations on the street. But it was actually a period of a couple months between the publication of the cartoons and the riots, which followed. And it was because important audiences became accelerants rather than decelerants of reaction. And when we find ourselves in heightened political moments, we need people who can act as decelerants to help calm and cool things, as well as those who can act as accelerants when the cause is just. When I was 14 years old, our Boy Scout troop decided to have each boy build a kayak out of fiberglass. I recognize this experience may not be universal, so I'd like to describe the process. Making something with fiberglass, or Kevlar, which is a very similar process of construction and is used to create protective armor, includes creating numerous elements or layers. The process begins by adding a base layer of resin into a mold, which acts as the binding agent for the fiberglass. Then a thin sheet of Kevlar or fiberglass, which has a fabric-like appearance, is spread over the resin. The excess resin is forced out with rollers, and the fiberglass is stretched until it is taut. The process is then repeated numerous times, using a roller each time to dispose of the excess resin and to press the layers together. You also have elements needed for shape, such as a foam to form parts of the canoe. You repeat the process until everything is covered in several layers, and finally bind everything together with the use of vacuum pressure. In this metaphor, we can think of the many ideas about the role of religion in bringing peace and in lowering the temperature in our culture wars as sheets of fabric. And I was inspired, as I imagine you were, with Ambassador Saperstein's call for us each to do something, to really move forward and to stand up for each other. Well, this metaphor, the metaphor of the kayak, raises a question. What is the resin that holds these layers together, the layers of our good intentions? What is it that binds them and makes them strong? I would argue that as Americans, the binding agent is our basic foundational values, including the inalienable rights outlined in documents such as the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As we think about the pressures around us, we're also aware of what is sometimes called the Bakken-Ford dilemma. Bakken-Ford was a justice of the German Constitutional Court in the post-World War II era. And he identified that a liberal, secularized state lives by prerequisites which it cannot guarantee itself. Bakenford said, this is a quote, "This is the great adventure it, liberal democracy, has undertaken for freedom's sake. As a liberal state, it can endure only if the freedom it bestows on its citizens takes some regulation from the interior, both from moral substance of the individuals and a certain homogeneity of society at large. On the other hand, it cannot by itself procure these interior forces of regulation. That is not with its own means, such as legal compulsion and authoritative decree. Doing so, it would surrender its liberal character and fall back in a secular manner into the claim of totality it once led the way out of, back then into the confessional civil wars." And so, as Bakenford conceives it, the challenge for liberal democracies is cultivating the conditions that make the perpetuation of liberal democracy possible, that the liberal democracy itself does not per se create. I would like to focus from a U.S. perspective on how democracies can hold themselves together, focusing on our first president, George Washington. I emphasize this because we are here as Americans, and I think the lessons that George Washington has are particularly acute for us here now, but also resonate globally. The resin that binds us together is perhaps best described in the United States tradition by George Washington as, quote, "a spirit of amity and mutual deference." In a letter George Washington sent to the states announcing his retirement from military service, he offered, quote, "an earnest prayer that God, quote, would incline the hearts of the citizens to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another. Without these things," he said, quote, "we can never hope to be a happy nation." In writing about the successful Constitutional Convention, Washington said it was this spirit of amity and mutual deference that were essential to producing the Constitution. This is the idea of civic charity, as articulated by people like Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln, the Reverend Martin Luther King, and many others. One of my favorite examples is Lincoln's second inaugural, which is perhaps the most important speech in American political history. Lincoln concludes with these soaring, majestic words: "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Now note, these are words that were spoken before the formal end of the Civil War, at a time when the divisions separating us were the greatest they had ever been in the history of our country. And yet it was this feeling of care for each other that Lincoln urged upon us. I'd like to conclude by returning to George Washington. He wrote important letters to religious groups when he was elected president. One of these was the Society of Quakers. This was significant because the Quakers were pacifists and would not fight in the war, or even lend money for the war effort, and were widely seen as supporting the British during the American Revolution. Yet, at the end, Washington writes this very conciliatory letter. In it he says, quote, "I assure you very explicitly that in my opinion, the conscientious scruples of all men should be treated with great delicacy and tenderness. And it is my wish and desire that the laws may also always be as extensively accommodated to them as the due regard to the protection and essential interests of the nation may justify and permit." In this, I think, we can detect an early iteration of what became the compelling state interest test. The idea that we should accommodate conscience whenever possible and limit it only when protecting the essential interests of the nation makes it necessary. A second letter was to the Hebrew congregation in Newport, Rhode Island. Jews in revolutionary America were a tiny minority, misunderstood, and suffered a great deal of discrimination. This is what Washington wrote to them. "All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, in giving it on all occasions their effectual support." Washington then concludes with an allusion to the Old Testament prophet Micah's vision of a day when swords would be turned into plowshares and everyone would dwell safely under their own vine and fig tree. Washington wrote, "May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. May the Father of all mercies scatter light and not darkness in our paths, and make us all in our several vocations useful here, and in his own due time and way everlastingly happy." Aren't these remarkable words? I don't know that our presidents are capable of writing and expressing themselves in a manner that comes close to this. Of all of the founding fathers, Washington is the one that has had the greatest re-estimation in my mind. I was sort of taught as a boy that he was a jock. He was tall. He looked good on a horse. He was a commanding physical presence. But the intellectual and moral power of what he's writing in these letters is stunning, and I think deeply relevant for us today as Americans. Now, at lunch, Reverend Bob Roberts ended with a question to both Ambassador Seipel and Ambassador Brownback. Sorry, Saperstein. Thank you for the correction. Bob Seipel was the first head of the office, but and an earlier ambassador, but I misspoke. And the answers they gave were profound about the importance for us to step forward, to take action, to be engaged, to not remain silent, and to stand for each other. For those from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, we are familiar with a parable taught by one of the 12 apostles, Dieter F. Uchtdorf. He described a group at church who were trying to move a heavy grand piano without much success. Finally, one older gentleman said, "Let's each lift where we stand." And they moved the piano. Those words, simple, have inspired me to try to lift where I stand as director of the International Center for Law and Religion Studies at Brigham Young University. And I am confident that as each of us lift where we stand, we can make real contributions to peace building in our communities, countries, and in the world. I've been thinking about a new formulation based upon all of the ideas that we've been hearing today about lowering the temperature. Perhaps it is the deep commitments to values such as freedom, equality, dignity, the rule of law, equal protection under the law, due process, equality of opportunity, and an equal chance to shape our lives that are the necessary binding agent that underlies the liberal project. Rabbi Saperstein spoke about how important it is that we have common ground around certain basic fundamental values. We can disagree about much, but we can still agree about the basic importance of religious freedom. I have come to believe that it is a shared commitment to religious freedom, for our willingness to stand for each other, that is the bond that makes us free. This is the binding agent that resolves the Bakken-Ford dilemma. If we are deeply committed to each other's freedom, including each other's religious freedom, including, of course, the right not to believe, to not practice any faith, this is the resin or binding agent that tethers us one to another. I'd like to conclude by quoting what our Savior, Jesus Christ, in the New Testament said. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." May we each, where we stand, strive to be peacemakers, strive to lower temperature, try to moderate the volume, and may God bless us, everyone. Thank you.
We'll next hear from Robert Hunt. And Robert is really the driving force behind this organization. When Mark Romney and I cooked up the idea that we should have a DFW Alliance, it was Robert who helped us figure out that we could hold that here at SMU. He knew a lot of people, and he's just been a tremendous supporter, become a very cherished friend. Robert is the Director of Global Theological Education at the Perkins School, where we held the first DFW Summit 5 years ago. And he has led the most interesting life. He's been an educator and a pastor and spent years of his life living in Malaysia, Kuala Lumpur, in Singapore, in Vienna, a city where I lived myself for a couple of years, and is now responsible for helping educate Methodist pastors across the country, maybe the world, I'm not sure, Robert. And after Robert speaks, we'll see if the two of them have a few questions answers to our questions. Robert?
Thanks. I wish I'd been so thoughtful as to print something out, but I'm going to look down at my phone occasionally. I don't know how many of you remember the t-shirts from the 1990s called No Fear. I think they were sponsored by Adidas or someone like this. My son, who was an adolescent in those times, had a couple of them. One of them said, "Second place is first loser." And then the other one said, "If you're not standing on the edge, you're taking up too much space." Now, this was very much, for me, having lived 20 years overseas, in cool cultures, these were very characteristic of what had come to seem to me like an incredibly bombastic and overly emotional American culture. First loser, really, second place. You're taking up too much space. These are not the attitudes of people who are seeking the center, right? And that may be the prevalent reason that 30 years or so onward, we find that by far the most popular religion in the United States today focuses on words like centering and meditation and cooling down. We've had a lot of heat. We've had a lot of heat. And that was very different for me. In the 20 years that I was overseas, I lived in Malaysia, first of all, for 7 years. I became fluent in the Malay language. I did my PhD at the University of Malaya, so I became fairly ensconced in Malay culture. Had a chance to spend some time in Indonesia and Javanese culture. And one of the things about Malaysian culture, Malay culture I should say really, Malay culture was that the overt expression of emotion, and particularly anger, was simply not acceptable. And certainly not in public. This was associated with a loss of self-control. I asked one of my friends why the Javanese didn't drink, and he said the possibility of having a drink and losing a little bit of self-control just wasn't acceptable. It had nothing to do with religious feelings, right? They just didn't want to lose control. Then I moved to Austria and Germany. And again, Germanic culture is kind of a cool culture. It's a kind of cool language even. I remember my first annual conference, I'm a United Methodist, the first annual conference that we had of our Methodist church in Austria, which was very, very small. It would have been smaller than the number of people in this room. Shocked me in two ways. And the first way was that we opened the conference with the tapping of the conference keg by the bishop. Now, this is not the United Methodism that I was raised in. My grandfather was a fundamentalist circuit rider, and we had his sermons. He had a great deal to say about the demon rum. But that was one part. But the second part was that a relatively intense argument, if you could call anything intense in this setting, grew up between one church and the bishop about their pastor. I don't need to go into the details of it. But I could tell that something was amiss when the bishop actually stood up from his chair, indicating that the emotional temperature had gone up a good deal, and I didn't realize it. And so finally, the bishop said to my neighbor, who was a representative of the opposite side, "Bist du zufrieden?" Are you satisfied? Of course, using the familiar German, "Bist du zufrieden?" And my neighbor stood up and said, "Nein, no." And they both sat down and the conference went on. And I thought, that's how it plays out here? Are you satisfied? Nope. Sat down. This was about 5 years later. I got into an argument with a vendor who serviced our copy machine about whether his Techniker was going to come out and repair it. And he insisted that I needed to be there between 2 and 4 on one day because that's when the Techniker was available. And I insisted that because I had purchased his product, his Techniker could come when it was convenient to me. And we went back and forth a little bit on this. And it ended the same way. He said, "The Techniker is coming between 2 and 4. And I said, "And I will not be here." And I hung up the phone. And my assistant, who was quite fluent in German, had been listening to the whole thing on the speakerphone, said, "Dr. Hunt, you've had the perfect Austrian argument." Both parties calmly and quietly insisted that they were unhappy. And they quit talking because it couldn't go anywhere else, right? There was nowhere else to go. Well, so coming from these cool cultures, coming to the United States, it was like, whoa, what happened here? I mean, for one thing, I landed in New York. I'm a Texan, but everybody in New York was talking in a loud tone of voice. There was an ad on the television that showed some big sweaty guy in the middle of Union Station with a copying machine, and copies were coming out, and he was sweating. He was, no, like this. And there's another ad that's a woman in a bar, and she's going, "You busted my chops. You gonna order the Miller Lite or not?" I'm going, who are these people? Who are these people? I mean, why is there so much of this overt expression of emotion, and especially anger, because it's acceptable. It's the way we do things. It's acceptable to manipulate people into feeling very strong feelings, and people love it. They go to have that happen to them. I mean, now that I think back at it, my grandfather, when he preached religious revivals out in West Texas, people came voluntarily to hear him preach. You should read his sermons. They came voluntarily to get heated up. And I think there's something there. And the reason is because American culture really has been influenced by our dominant religious culture, which was evangelical Protestantism, a revival culture. And the revival culture, especially from the 1850s onwards, I'd love to give you a long sermon on this, or at least a lecture, and the decision by evangelical revival preachers to accept what were called the use of means in relationship to Gordon Finney. Now, this is history you don't want, but I'm going to give it to you real fast anyway. There was actually a big debate. Could you use emotions to get people to convert? Believe it or not. Because that should be the work of the Holy Spirit for those of you that are Christians. If you're not Christian, that just means, can you use emotions to get people to change their religious ideas? And the answer turned out to be yes. There was a debate, but the answer was yes. And from that point onward, emotional manipulation and emotionalism in revival was an absolutely acceptable way to move people to the crisis that would make them make a decision. To heat things up was the way you get people to decide. And that, I think, has bled into our popular culture. It's become part of American culture. You can love it or you can hate it. It's just there. It's mixed with other cultural influence as well, because we had cultural influences from cultures that were also a lot hotter than German culture. Italians, Irish, etc. But the end result is this. Raising the temperature to get action is okay. Look at the political attack ads that are on right now. Across the board, I think they're vile. But the reason they happen election after election is because they work. People aren't spending millions of dollars on stuff that doesn't work. Good heavens, look at every other ad. According to our ads, Americans will cry happy tears over dishwasher detergent. Even more over a car. Can you imagine? Because action in our minds comes when you raise the temperature, which creates a crisis that prompts to decision. It's part of our culture. The problem is that action in the midst of heat and fire is often chaotic and ineffective. I think of Captain Scully, notably did not raise his voice. He landed the plane. Rational, calm, considered action. Panicking and getting heated up in the midst of a crisis almost never works. I've spent years in Austria working with members of the diplomatic community. One of the things I admired is they typically didn't get heated up because they were problem solvers. I think this is one reason we hear good things out of business. Typically, business doesn't get heated up inside. It may sell its products with heat, but it understands that inside things need to be relatively cool or you don't get the products developed. So I think we need a change in our understanding of the basis of not only action, but of effective action. We need a countercultural affirmation of the value of cool rationality. People are drawn to a fire. That is the reality. And that probably goes deep back into our primal history, where fire was a good thing, warmth, etc. People are drawn to a fire. It has a place in political and religious motivation, but fire isn't useful for actually making decisions. So how do we cool things down? Well, I'm going to offer just a few things, and they're almost maudlin, but I hope you'll get them. The first thing is we can focus on facts. We've been talking, the sort of theme of this thing, in the midst of these court decisions, which seem to have heated things up a good deal. So what about a focus on facts? Well, I'm an academic, which means I probably have too much time on my hands. So I just want to say that I've not only read all of the Supreme Court decisions recently, but I've read their references in law. And I will tell you this, that alone will cool you down if it doesn't actually put you to sleep. they're really not as hot as you think. They're actually really kind of tedious. And almost invariably, they don't say what you heard on TV. Okay. But the main thing here is that when we read and get the facts on court decisions, on legislation, etc., worst case scenario, we gain enough knowledge that if we're against it, we can act against it. We know what the weaknesses are. We see the problems. We can figure out what the solutions are, which getting angry, getting hot really doesn't do. But also, of course, it helps purge the supernatural from public discourse. And this, I think, is another unfortunate, I would say it's unfortunate, problem of our religious background, okay? What we have now is often an assumption, and I do think it's from revival religion, that somehow behind every public decision that is taken, there are actually some kind of either demonic or angelic forces. That what we see isn't the truth. In reality, it's a demon back there, whatever we think is demonic, right? Or an angel back there that's making it happen. So that somehow every single decision, every piece of legislation is ramped up into a struggle between good and evil that's coming to an apocalyptic ending. Well, of course you're going to get heated up about that. I just have to say, I got heated up about that kind of stuff when I was in junior high and high school. This is Dallas, Texas. We had a teacher from DTS talk to us. Those were the great days of Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth. Everything was, angels. It was angels and demons. Man, it was a huge, massive struggle. It was all going to happen. Well, it didn't happen in time, so I lost my faith in that. But, I mean, the angels and the demons. But if all you see when you see a public face, whether it's a Supreme Court justice or it's the President of the United States, or it's a legislature, or we'll take your pick, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, if what you see is not their face and what they're actually doing, but a demon or an angel, then of course things are going to get hot. The temperature goes up because we're dealing with the supernatural. And in the supernatural, there's only emotionalism and irrationality. There's nothing rational about the supernatural, and there's no rational way to deal with the supernatural. I lived for years in cultures where there were exorcisms. I myself have been invited to perform an exorcism, more than one. A little bit shocking, we didn't learn that at Perkins School of Theology when I was there, just saying. Yeah, but exorcisms are not about the cool rationality. They're about emotion, anger, raised voices, all of that. What we know from history is that when the temperature goes up, because we think it's all supernatural, that it's angels and demons, when the temperature's up, someone gets burned. Usually they get burned at the stake. And that's not good for public discourse. That just destroys human lives. So how do we lower the temperature? One of the things we can say here in Dallas, Texas is that in 20 years, more, I've been here for 17 years now, back in the US for 17 years, but there's been going on for longer. In many years, 2 decades, 3 decades, interreligious dialogue has considerably lowered the temperature in the city. Whatever one may think of Dallas, positively or negatively, it's better than when I came. And I think that's because a number of different groups have worked with absolute steadiness to put Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, and Buddhists in the same room to talk to each other and to know each other. It is very hard to demonize someone who just passed you the baklava or the potato salad. It helps, it has helped. One of my friends almost must have when I was a bit down 3 years ago about whether all this made a difference, and she said, Robert, look, it has made a difference. 8 years ago, 7 years ago, there were men with guns marching around mosques. In Dallas, Texas, that's not acceptable anymore. Now we just have to make sure it's not acceptable at polling booths. So, as experienced in business, the higher the contact and mutual knowledge, the lower the temperature. and that's one of the keys. Second is a common mission. I was just talking to Ken, I think that it may be easier in business in some ways because the common mission is recognized, shareholder value, we need to make a profit, we need to develop products, and we need to sell them. It's harder to find the common mission of a nation, but I think Brett has spoken to this. If we can see that as a nation we do have a common mission, the promotion of human rights and human dignity, the promotion of democracy across the world, things that have motivated us for centuries, then it lowers the temperature because we're working together on something together. Things get hot when we're each focused on our individual needs and we're dueling over the turf. We're all little atoms of enriched uranium. When we're together too much and too close, something explodes. Better when we're all focused on something else. And finally, the frameworks that create safe spaces lower the temperatures of debate. Here in the university, we're working on this constantly in our classrooms. How do we make the classroom a place where people treat each other with dignity, listen to each other, and learn from one another? That is an intentional effort. We heard this again, the realm of business. It's an intentional effort. It doesn't come about naturally. It's an intentional effort in my theological school, where, believe me, we have enough diversity that we also have sometimes more heat than light. But we create those intentional frameworks. And finally, we need to come back, and I think this is for us as both religious people, as secular people, as political leaders, to absolutely promote our belief in a common humanity and the value of humanity in and of itself and the promotion of it. And I think when we can do that, we can overcome some of our unfortunate but fascinating backgrounds and lower the temperature a little bit. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you, Brett. We've got a little time here for some questions. We have questions for either one of these gentlemen. I have a question. You know, we've talked about some great ideas here, theories, and we'll hear a little bit more about that from our next speaker. But Brett, you talked at length about just the wonderful words of our founders. We don't expect to hear that from our current politicians. But you talked about their magnificent, uplifting thoughts about the nation. What were the possibilities and what were the requirements? And Robert, you gave us some thoughts about some specifics about what should be required to lower the temperature of our dialogue in the nation. Can both of you just take a couple of minutes and apply that to those who are here with us in this audience and with us on the internet? What does that mean for each of us individually? What can we do on a citizen basis in our communities, whatever our callings are in our churches, our businesses? What is the action item that we can take from this? What would be the most important action items that we could take from this? Robert, do you want to go first?
So I think the most important action item in my world is and really in all the religious worlds, and probably applies to business, is the intentional fostering of dialogue and the seeking of common causes that we can pursue together, even when we don't agree on a lot of things. There's a lot of things we can't agree on. And I think that, Eboo Patel is a good example of this. Some of the work that Faith Commons has done, also the DFW, Faith Forward DFW. We don't have to agree on everything, but if we work together on the things that we agree on, we find that we are working together, we see the positive value in each other, even when we have violent disagreements even. And then we can move forward on that basis, and that I think are the concrete kinds of things we can do. One of the things I like to do is assign my students who are most violently at odds with each other theologically to do a common project. Because now they either learn to work together or neither one of them gets a good grade. And typically they can do that without a whole lot of trouble because whatever the theological disagreement is not relevant to my class. So I think that's the one kind of concrete thing I can think of right away is we find the ways very locally, really, that we can work together. I think it's not out of school to say that I'm in a United Methodist congregation that's in the midst of discernment about whether it actually wants to split from the United Methodist Church. I hope that doesn't happen. But as part of the process, the leadership of the church is making us sit down at tables and talk to each other. I think we've done it 4 times now. I'm actually getting tired of it. But you know what? It does kind of work. You know, I got to sit next to some guy that he does all these things that I don't like, and I go, he's kind of a decent guy, and I know he's got 2 kids, and he teaches Sunday school. So maybe he's not that bad, right? Maybe we just disagree on this. I think that kind of thing can help a great deal. I preached a sermon on this, but I'm not going to introduce Christian scripture into the mix. So, okay.
You know, my thinking on this was really influenced by the lunch talk that Judge Griffith gave at this gathering last year, I think. And he'll be able to, he's speaking next, so he can correct me if I'm misremembering this. But my recollection is he was talking about the Constitutional Convention and sort of that very hot summer of 1789 in Philadelphia and 1787, thank you, 1787 in Philadelphia, and you know, very different disparate interests. I mean, agrarian interests versus urban interests, slaveholding versus non-slaveholding interests, and what made it work was there were a group of people who were determined to not let it fail. And so the success of the enterprise became more important to them than winning, even on points that were quite important to them. And I've really been thinking about that because, you know, being right and winning is a really important set of values in our culture, and we care about them deeply. You know, we've got Vince Lombardi, and we've got, you know, Hank Steinbrenner, or is that the father of Steinbrenner? Maybe Hank is the son who doesn't care so much about winning. But Father Steinbrenner sure did. And so I think there's something about this idea that, you know, we are going to insist upon succeeding that is even more important than winning. And somehow if we have that sort of common vision of mutual deference, of, you know, what, that's the word that George Washington used, the spirit of amity, then maybe we have a chance.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that. We'd like to thank them both for their remarks and invite Judge Griffith to come up, if you would.
Which way? This way.
Can't get up there. Oh.
Thank you.
I'll just briefly introduce Thomas Griffith, who has become a great friend of ours and a great friend of mine. I appreciate so much that he is with us again, and for his tremendous life, which demonstrates the ability to bring together disparate people. Just briefly on his background, he was, after recently appointed by one of our neighbors here, George Bush, as the to the D.C. Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., Circuit Court of Appeals. And since retiring from that, he's been a lawyer, an active lawyer and involved as the senior advisor to the National Institute of Civil Discourse. Judge Griffith is also a senior fellow at the Whitney Institute at BYU and a lecturer at Harvard University. And in my mind, one of the most wonderful aspects of his career is he was the nonpartisan Senate legal counsel and chief legal officer for the United States Senate, which is an organization that doesn't always agree on everything. And so we're just grateful to have him here. Appreciate the fact that he flew in this morning and is flying back out tonight and is tremendously committed to the cause for which we are here. So, Judge Griffith.
Thank you very much, Bill, and it really is a pleasure to be here. This is a great enterprise. I echo what Ambassador Saperstein said about your efforts and the success of this venture. I want to thank Dr. Hunt and Professor Scharfs for those remarkable remarks. They were beautiful and poignant and needed. There were two moments that I've enjoyed everything that I've seen, but there are two moments today I just want to focus on in particular. And what happened earlier today at the very end of the panel on how to protect LGBTQ brothers and sisters in the tensions that sometimes come between claims of religious liberty and claims of non-discrimination. And it occurred right at the end of the panel, and it was between Shannon Minter, who's from the National Center for Lesbian Rights, and Steve Sandberg, who's the general counsel of BYU. And my guess is if we were to go out to the general public who follows these things and describe somebody from the National Center for Lesbian Rights and somebody from BYU, your initial reaction would be, well, that's going to be an interesting get-together, you know? And it was. It was interesting to see the genuine respect and profound affection they had for one another. And it was displayed most powerfully in a comment that Shannon made at the end, and I won't be able to quote him, but he in effect said, you know, when I first met Steve Sandberg from BYU, I assumed some things about him and how he would be. And over time, as I've gotten to know him and learned to respect and love him, I found out that I was wrong. And I think Steve would say the same thing. And so to me, if we could just bottle that experience up, it gets to the very heart and soul of what I want to speak about in terms of lowering the temperature. And then the other moment I just have to mention, Rabbi Saperstein, at the end of your talk, I was ready to man the barricades. That was just moving a set of remarks as I've heard along. I haven't been that excited about something since Sunday afternoon, the bottom of the 8th inning, and Sharper hit the home run. That was pretty good. So thank you. So my remarks are going to be focused on the United States. I apologize to be so parochial, but that's all I know. I don't even know that well, but I'm going to be talking about this issue in the context of the United States. And I'm going to do two things that are very risky pedagogically, okay, at least for me. The first is, not yet, right? I'm going to use a slide. Now, I don't do this. I barely use a computer. I use fountain pens. And I use the slide, and I'm already thrown off a little bit because I got a computer here in front of me. So anyway, but when the time's right, I choose the right on that. Okay, gotcha. Okay, the right button there. And the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to read to you something that's going to take several minutes for you to listen to. Now, I've thought long and hard about whether I should do that. It's late afternoon. That's the kiss of death. But I'm going to do it anyway because I think this group will find it a gripping account of something that answers, I think, tries to address the last question that Bill posed. That's the critical question, right? What now? What do we do? What do we do with all this? So when we get there, I'll read it in a lively way, and hopefully it'll keep going. So first of all, lowering the temperature. Great title. Lowering the temperature is the right thing to do. Right? It's the right thing to do. But more than that, I want to suggest that it's the only way to preserve religious freedom. I really believe that. The only way to preserve religious freedom is for us to lower the temperature. Let me tell you how I get to that conclusion. I'm going to speak personally for a moment. I'm a Christian who practices his Christianity as a Latter-day Saint. And a number of years ago, there was a talk given by one of the leaders of my faith tradition, Dallin Oaks, who was one of the presiding authorities in the church. And he gave a talk that stunned me. It surprised me. This is about 7 or 8 years or so ago. He was speaking to it's a strange gathering in Sacramento, a group of clergy and judges. I don't know the history behind that. He spoke to a group of clergy and judges, and this is what he said. And this made the front page of the New York Times. And so, I didn't even know about it, but one of my colleagues on the DC circuit called me and said, "Have you read the article in the Times about what Dallin Oaks said?" I said, "No." So I got it. And here's the money quote for me, from Dallin Oaks. "Difference on fundamentals are with us forever. We must not let them disable our democracy or cripple our society. This does not anticipate that we will deny or abandon our differences, but that we will learn to live with those laws, institutions, and persons who do not share them. We may have cultural differences, but we should not have culture wars." Well, I gotta tell you, that struck me to the quick, because I had always considered myself a culture warrior. No, the barbarians are at the gate, we gotta defend ourselves to the last, the world's going to hell in a handbasket, and we've got to save it against these awful forces, I sort of thought of myself as a culture warrior, and here was a leader of my faith, someone who I view as an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ, telling me, "You're wrong, Griffith. You're not a culture warrior. We are not at war with our fellow citizens. No. You need to think differently than that." It really shook me up in a positive way. And so that's how I approach this now. I approach that if you and I, in defending religious freedom, are culture warriors, we're missing the picture, and we're actually doing damage to the cause of religious freedom. It may feel good, right? It may feel good, but it doesn't work, and it's wrong. So let's remember some first principles. The word religion, right? We're people of faith. The word religion. What does the word religion mean? I mean, etymologically, we understand the word religion means to bind together. That ligament comes from the same root. The idea behind religion is it takes things that are separate and binds them together. Takes humans and binds them to deity, right? Takes humans and binds them to one another. What some have referred in the Christian idiom to the vertical pull of the atonement of Christ, bringing us to God, or to the horizontal pull of the atonement of Christ, bringing us to one another. That's what religion means. How ironic it is, and Ambassador Brownback pointed this out today. It's not ironic, it's tragic. How often religion, that which is intended to bind us to God and to bind us to our neighbors, has been used as a divisive force throughout history, right? That's not just ironic, that's tragic. Okay, so with that, let's see if you got this. I have been well prepared to do this. Here we go. Here's my message. That's my message. Okay, so I'm done. Yeah, I love this. Yeah, okay, you were a believer, I got it, but did you have to be a jerk about it, right? Did you have to be? So here's the variation on the theme I'm gonna use from here on out is, if we want to be defenders of religious freedom, stop being such jerks about it, right? be decent people. Now, okay, now let's move away from the context of it. How do I get rid of this now, Mark?
One more time.
Push it again? Okay, thanks. So now let me move more into my, my legal mode. And Professor Scharf's made reference to this. I'm just going to elaborate on it just a little bit. So for Americans, what binds us together is our commitment to the Constitution of the United States, right? If you're a civil officer in the United States, or if you're a military officer, you take an oath of office, and that oath says somewhere in it that you take an oath to support and defend the Constitution, right? And we're unique in that way. It's not to a monarch or to any other entity. It's to the Constitution of the United States. And we all want to support and defend the Constitution. And that sort of language can rile us to action. Politicians are, and I normally do it as well, but I forgot, have their pocket constitutions that we pull out and we wave around. And I think that's all good. I think that's great. It's great. But too often, in my experience, people think supporting and defending the Constitution means, for example, that you are adamantly in support of gun rights because that's what the Second Amendment requires. I'm going to support and defend the Constitution because it protects my right to own a firearm. Or I'm going to support and protect the Constitution of the United States because it requires equal protection of the law to all folks. Now, I think I agree with both of those. I agree with both of those statements, but I think that's a really short-sighted view of what it means to support and defend the Constitution. So the argument I'm going to make, and I made it last year, and I'll give it a shorter version this year, is that to support and defend the Constitution, I think we need to understand not just the text of the Constitution, but the work of the Constitution and the way this Constitution was created. Because I think if we look at the way this Constitution is created, we can get a better view of what it means to support and defend it. We know the story, summer of 1787, things aren't going well. There's discussion to dissolve the convention in Philadelphia. And yet 6 weeks later, George Washington, they've succeeded in creating a constitution. George Washington, in his transmittal letter, and Professor Scharf referred to this earlier, says to Congress, this Constitution is the product of that spirit of amity and mutual deference, which the peculiarity of our political circumstances rendered indispensable. Spirit of amity and mutual deference. That was the only way we were going to get this thing done. Well, a young scholar who's a student of Michael McConnell, the Stanford law professor, young scholar named Derek Webb, did a really interesting deep dive into that phrase, spirit of amity, mutual deference. What was Washington talking about? What took place in Philadelphia that created this spirit of amity and mutual deference? And Webb comes up with a couple of ideas, and I'll just give them to you quickly, but I think they give us a to-do list on it. So the first one, he looks at the rules of the convention, the way they went about doing their business, and it turns out the rules were designed to get people to sit in the same room with one another and to listen to each other and to allow themselves to be persuaded by one another. Here were the rules. If you were in Philadelphia, you had to show up, right? If someone was talking on the floor, you had to shut up and you had to listen. You couldn't text, you couldn't read the newspaper, you had to listen to the person. The proceedings were in secret. There was no record taken, official record taken of the votes, which meant in May, you could vote yes on Proposition A, whatever it was, and yet in July, when that proposition came around to you, you could now vote no on it, and no one would run an attack ad against you saying you're a flip-flopper, right? The presumption was you sit there and listen to other people, and you might change your mind. You might change your mind. The second factor that Webb looks at is the socializing that took place. turns out there weren't a whole lot of boarding houses or taverns in Philadelphia at that time, not enough to accommodate everyone. So they ended up sleeping in the same room, in the same bed. You had sometimes three people in a bed. They worked each day from 10 to 4, and then they ate the rest of the day. They go to taverns, they drink and eat, and within a couple of weeks in Philadelphia, they formed dinner groups. Isn't that cute? Dinner groups. And the dinner groups weren't, Federalists versus anti-Federalists, weren't slaveholders versus, abolitionists. No, they were just sort of thrown together so that you had people socializing with one another. At key moments during the summer, Benjamin Franklin, who had the nice house and had the great liqueurs, would bring everyone over, and they would have a great party. The libations would flow, the conviviality was fabulous. The result of all this, George Mason, who wasn't a big fan of the Constitution, wrote to his son, and I'm translating in a colloquial fashion here, he said, we actually got to like each other. We actually found out that we liked each other, even though he's from Massachusetts. Can you imagine that? Who would have thought that you could like somebody from Massachusetts? But they did. So these two elements were the critical parts of what Webb thinks took place that summer. First, that they listened to each other and were open to persuasion. Second, that they formed friendships by socializing. Now, before I get to the third point, let me just talk about those two. Social scientists tell us that the only way you can persuade someone, it's a really hard thing to do to persuade someone, right? But the only way you can do it is if you first listen to another person and can state to that person what they just did. You show that you understand what they said. And next, that there's some personal relationship there, right? So if you want to change anybody's viewpoints, you have to listen to them, you have to understand them, and they have to trust you, right? So those are the first two things that took place in Philadelphia. Here's the third one, and I think this is the most important one. Professor Sharps is indicated, has referred to it. When things were, what's the phrase? It's always darkest right before it gets really dark, And so when it was really dark, when it looked like it was going to fall apart, 11 moderates, not a bad word, at least it wasn't in the summer of 1787. 11 moderates met at Benjamin Franklin's home, and they made a deal with each other, right? And the deal was, we're not going to let this thing fail. We're going to make this convention succeed. And here's the way they implemented it. They decided that they were going to compromise for the sake of creating a union, even before they knew the terms of the compromise. That is risky, but they were willing to do it. They were betting that if they gave up something they liked, others would give up things that they liked for the sake of unity. But it was unity, the creation of union, that was the key element. So three things. Here are three items. If you're making your to-do list, here are the three items that we learned from the Constitutional Convention of 1787, that I would argue, if we aren't doing these things, we are not supporting independent the Constitution, even though we're carrying it around in our handbooks or in our jackets. The first one is to listen and be open to persuasion. This is a rhetorical question, so don't raise your hand. When was the last time you changed your mind based on something that someone told you? And if it hasn't been recently, that's a problem. That's a problem. The first thing, you need to get yourself in a situation where you listen to people who have different views than you do, and listen to them carefully. And so what that means is, if you are consuming most of your information from cable outlets or from social media, stop it. You know what I mean? Stop it. You are being played. It's all about ratings games. It's all about advertising. It is. It's all about ratings games. It's all about advertising. It's not, don't call it news. This isn't news. This is information, and you're being played. So that's the first thing to do. Get off it. Cut the plug. The governor of Utah, Spencer Cox, said, I used to watch cable a lot. I've been sober for the last 8 years. And that's true. So stop. If you're doing that, that's the first thing. Stop it. But find yourself in a place where you are listening to people who have different views than you do, and be open to persuasion. They might be right, you might be wrong. Second thing, you need to have friendships with people who are different than you. If you look at your circle of friends right now, who do you socialize? I know it's COVID, there's not a whole lot of socializing, but think about the people that you would like to have over for Sunday dinner or Friday night. And if it doesn't include people who are different than you in some way, repent, change. You gotta broaden your circle. Get outside of your little silos, of our own little silos. So that's the second to-do item from the framers of 1787. And then the third one's more difficult, but the most important. You need, in your thinking, our thinking, and when I say you, I'm talking about me too. This is directed at me as much as it is you. We need to be able to compromise for the sake of unity. In other words, I need to be able to give up some things that are important to me so that you will feel safe and comfortable in this space. No, that needs to be my thinking. I need to actually be thinking more about you than about me. And I need to have a frame of mind that I want you. I want to be in community with you, and I want you to feel safe in that community. And if I'm doing things that don't make you feel safe, I need to be willing to give those up. Now that's really risky, I get it. That's not hardball politics, I get it. I get it totally. That's not anything of this world, right? It's a different way of living. But here's the gamble. The gamble is, if I do that, I'm hoping that you're going to do that for me. That you will be so moved by my statement that I want you to feel safe and comfortable, that you will reciprocate. Now, what if that doesn't happen? It might not. But I can't think of any other way to go forward than to try that. So that's the third, compromise for the sake of unity. Okay, that's all grand talk, nice Sunday school lesson, amen, great. Does it work? Now here's where I'm going to test your patience a little bit. It works. I'm going to read you a story written by a woman named Melanie Tagg. She's in the county where I live. I live in Loudoun County, Virginia. Loudoun County, Virginia is ground zero in the culture wars over public schools. We love the place. It's beautiful. We love the high concentration of people of faith. Churches are packed on Sundays in Loudoun County. Lots of really good people, lots of sincere people, and the place is being torn apart in anger over debates surrounding what's going on in public schools. It's going to take a couple minutes, but I want you to hear Melanie Tagg's experience just as one person who saw this and said, this is not the way we ought to be. Okay, she's part of a group that's called the Community Levy Association. So here you go. We at the Community Levy Association began to talk about how we could bring some measure of civility and then ideally some policy compromise to the debate. And the debate was over the protections for LGBTQ students in public schools. The state of Virginia had mandated that each school district put in place policies that would protect LGBTQ kids. And so that's the debate was, so what does that mean? We used a few methods, emails to school board members, social media posts, etc., to seek to slow the process before the school board to give us time to find mechanisms for building unity among opponents. None of these efforts bore noticeable fruit. As a result, we at the CLA decided to try to sponsor some sort of meeting ourselves, one that brought stakeholders of all types to the table, hoping some sort of compromise would rise to the top. Despite our relative inexperience, we forged ahead optimistically, confident that we could do some good. Our first item of business was to find participants willing to meet together and talk about issues with those that by all measures were opponents. A group of leaders from the local LGBT plus advocacy group agreed to attend. Several individuals affiliated with the religious right agreed to attend, including a right-leaning activist. We developed an agenda that first sought to build trust and next sought to specifically address the proposed policy changes. We met our first major obstacle by sending out the formal invitation and agenda to all the participants. Our LGBT friends were reluctant to meet with some of the named participants from the right due to a lack of trust that there would be openness and civility. Additionally, it became evident quite quickly that neither side knew us and knew that they could trust us. So the idea emerged that we should hold two initial meetings, one between the CLA and the religious right folks, and one between the CLA and the LGBTQ folks. Each side agreed to these meetings. One side note needs emphasis here, Melanie adds. Because an LGBT protection policy was mandated by Virginia, it was virtually a given that some version of the proposed policy would be passed by the school board. By all standards, the LGBT leaders had no need to meet with us. They had won. There was no quantifiable reason to need us, and no apparent benefit from dealing with or meeting or compromising with those with whom they disagreed. What an extraordinary message was sent when they, the winners, agreed to meet along with the conservative leaders, together demonstrating that conciliation, bridge building, and wise and honest compromise was the best way forward. These LGBT leaders are especially to be commended. What a marvelous thing when the group that holds the majority of votes in some way is still interested in coming to the table to create consensus, unity, and improvement. We were deeply thankful for their leadership in this. Okay. In June, the CLA met one morning, first with opponents of the policy changes, and then advocates of the policy changes. The first meeting had 3 CLA members and 4 community members in attendance. There were some trust-building exercises held as we got to know each other, such as basic things like, what's your favorite childhood memory, and what would you consider a perfect meal? And then there was candid sharing of what each person's interest was in the policy. It seemed that as each person spoke, they were being candid about their concerns. All sharing was civil and measured. Some wanted to broaden the discussion beyond the policy issue and include other issues such as mask mandates and critical race theory discussions. But we felt strongly that in order to be effective, we needed to focus exclusively on the LGBT proposed policies and help both sides find common ground on that issue. We at the CLA, almost immediately following the first session, the same 3 CLA members then met with 2 officers of Equality Loud, a prominent LGBT advocacy group in our county. This meeting followed the same pattern as the first. We shared personal stories, built trust, and then spoke specifically about the policies. The folks attending the second meeting passionately and civilly expressed their strong desires to offer protections to the LGBT students in the school system. While we were unsure as to how they would speak of religion and religious protections, we learned much from them about their sometimes positive religious experiences and about their hope that all interested parties could learn to find a way to protect all interests. We at the CLA, here's the conclusion, the big meeting, she said, we at the CLA felt like these 2 initial meetings were a resounding success. The primary measure of that success was that after holding these 2 meetings, our LGBT friends were now willing to come to the table, literally, to meet with those who opposed, on some level, the policy changes. And so we organized another meeting. We invited leaders from Equality Loudon to represent those in favor of the changes and we invited several participants of the few different faiths to represent those with objections to the policy changes. Because some of our earlier participants stated they weren't necessarily motivated by religious freedom, we sought to invite those who were feeling like almost closely aligned with following fairness for all principles. Now, the August meeting was nothing short of amazing. 9 people attended, 3 from our group, 3 interested in protecting religious freedom, 3 from Equality Loudon. We followed fairly similar practices from our earlier meetings, trust-building exercising, inviting participants to explain what each one's interest was in the policy, and talking about whether we had any common ground. Between each step, we went around the table asking each participant whether they felt enough trust to move on to the next agenda item. Each time, each was ready to move forward. When it came to talk about common ground, all around the table agreed that we hoped to do what was best for our children, for their safety, their learning, their dignity, their happiness. It became clear that there were many different points of view as to what that meant and how it would be reflected in the policy. There was a robust discussion about parental rights, student privacy, pronouns, bathrooms, locker rooms, school trips, and so on. As the hour grew late, we devised a simple plan. A Google Doc was created where any participant could propose a change or amendment or improvement to the policy. And under each proposal, each participating individual and/or group was listed. We then voted on whether or not we would accept the proposal, yes, no, or with revision. Our time frame was short. The school board vote was only a few days away. Additionally, we each agreed that we would only send to the school board those items that received unanimous approval from those at our meeting. It is of significant note that this meeting ended with handshaking, hugging, and an abundance of goodwill between the participants. And then they went home, and for 24 hours, the Google Doc was created. And here's the end of the story. 10 proposals were presented to this group, and they agreed on 8 of them. They didn't agree on all 10, but they agreed on 8. 2 groups who had never agreed on anything before agreed on 8. What had done it? What was the magic? The magic was small group dynamics, getting to know one another, listening, socializing, becoming friends. You want a to-do list? There it is. If that can be done in ground zero of the culture wars today, it can be done anywhere. I want to suggest that the people that were involved in that process were doing more to support and defend the Constitution of the United States than any patriot who's waving their pocket Constitution. Let me finish with this. I agree with Rabbi Saperstein. Maybe I'm an old cranky man now, but I think we are in peril as a nation. I really do. I believe the Constitution is in trouble right now. I believe it's hanging by a thread. You know, the framers were anxious when they created the Constitution. They weren't particularly optimistic. They were pretty nervous about this. And their greatest fear, they wrote about this extensively, their greatest fear wasn't necessarily invasion from Europe, although that was always a problem. Their greatest fear was a word that they used called faction. We would call it hyper-partisanship. That was their greatest fear. Of the 85 Federalist Society papers, of the 85 Federalist papers, 55 of them talk about faction. And of course, the most famous is Federalist number 10, where James Madison describes why all previous republics had failed. In all of history, they had all failed, and they all failed for the same reason. Faction, hyperpartisanship. Jonathan Haidt, the great social psychiatrist at NYU, has said recently, when there is so much hatred as we have right now, a democracy cannot work. You cannot get compromised. This, says Haidt, is what the framers feared. People who cared more about defeating the other side than the common good. Michael Gerson has written, American heroes are heroes of unity. The Constitution is designed for vigorous disagreement, but it cannot withstand a citizenry that views others with contempt. Our commitment is to support and defend the Constitution. The first image that comes to my mind when someone says, I'm going to support and defend the Constitution, is a martial image. I imagine me grabbing my musket, and running to the Lexington and Concord and firing a shot. We need to drop all that imagery, get rid of it. That's not what it means to support and defend the Constitution, I believe, at this hour. Let me give you a different image. It comes from Robert F. Kennedy. When he announced his candidacy for the presidency in March of 1968. Listen to these words and listen to how remarkable they sound today. Bobby Kennedy said, I run for the presidency because I want the United States to stand for the reconciliation of men. The reconciliation, wants the United States to stand for this principle of reconciliation. The most eloquent explanation I've heard of how that works today came again from Dallin Oaks 2 years ago. In an address on the Constitution, he said this, on contested issues, we seek to moderate and to unify. There's your test. You want to support and defend the Constitution, ask yourself, is the last thing I said on issue X or issue Y, was it seeking to moderate and to unify, or was it seeking to divide? It's my hope and prayer that we will all look inward and that we will seek to moderate and to unify. God bless us in our effort to do that, and God bless the United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you to everyone who has been here. This is a hope and an inspiration for you all. My comments would simply be to deliberate liberally over what you've heard, to pray about it for people of faith, generally in this room, and to follow the promptings you receive to get involved in our community for the sake of our community, our civility, and for the sake of our nation. We will be looking forward to getting all of this on the web. You'll be able to find these talks from all these sessions on the web within the next day or so. Is there a question in front? Yeah.
Yes, sir. I hope everybody can hear me. Thank you. Thank you. I hope everybody can hear me. I want to know, my name is Yves Willet, I'm from the Brotherhood of the Cross and Star. I want to know what made those 11 people, what did they rely on to know that they could trust each other? I mean, I heard from Dr. Hunt, usually I understand that religion is a spiritual tradition. At the center of it, there is a God. Is he the person I'm relying on to feel secure, to give my trust to the next person and engage that conversation? I want to know, is that what I'm relying on to start that? Because usually, if I don't have anything to rely on, where will I stand to start a conversation? Please enlighten me.
So I think the question is, we don't know. These 11 moderates, it turned out to be the whole convention agreed to it, right? I don't know enough about the 11 who gathered in Franklin's home to know if they were people of faith. We know there were people of faith at the convention. We also know there were people who were not of faith at the convention. I'm a person of faith, and so as I look at this issue, I'm very sympathetic to the perspective that you offer. But I don't believe it requires that one needs to be a Christian of faith to do this. But what I think it absolutely requires is you need to have a commitment to the idea that we want a multicultural society of diversity. That know that we want that. We don't shy away from that. That's what we want to do. And if we want to do that, I think we know the only way you can do that, and that is by following these principles that we were taught today and that the framers taught, and that is to be committed to it, to get to know people, to listen to people, be open to persuasion, to get outside your particular tribe, and get to appreciate this. The way I've said this in times before, maybe this is a little bit flippant, if you're a MAGA supporter, good for you. That's good. It's a free country. But if you're a MAGA supporter and you can't stand the thought of a Bernie Sanders supporter living in your neighborhood, that's wrong. If you're a Bernie Sanders supporter and you can't stand the thought of sitting down and breaking bread with a MAGA supporter, you're missing the point. Because what needs to happen here is we need to look beyond those labels and appreciate folks for who they are. We're not going to agree. There are big issues that we disagree about, and that's fine. That's good. It's America. We get to do that. But what I think the framers teach us is we need to be committed to the idea that we want to have a community with those people who are different from us. The compromises those framers made are not necessarily compromises I'm happy with. They made some awful compromises, right? Why did they do it? They did it for the sake of creating union. Some people wouldn't be willing to do that. There are plenty of people in the country today who say, no, that's too far. I don't want to be in a country that has that sort of deal. That one last thing, I can't take too much time. I don't want to be misunderstood. In the United States, if you want to be part of the family, there's a prior commitment here, okay? And you have to be fully committed to two principles: liberty and equality. If you're not committed to that, I'm sorry. No, I'm not. I don't want community with you. No. You can go elsewhere for that. There are plenty of places in the world that aren't committed to that. I'm sorry. But if you're committed to liberty and equality, let's come in and let's have a debate about what they mean. It's tough debate about what it means. But you've got to be committed to that to be in this community. So I offer that because it's not. There are boundaries to this. There are boundaries to this. I'm sorry, if you are a white supremacist, I'm sorry, I'm going to love you, I'm going to pray for you, but no, you're not. No, you're not part. You're not getting invited to Thanksgiving dinner. So there are boundaries to that. So anyway, I hope that was partially responsive.
We have any other questions here before we wrap up? All right. I'd like to thank everybody. I'm going to express a real thanks that you came, or you're listening here on the internet. We're so grateful for our speakers who just inspired me, and I hope everybody, we're so grateful for those who helped put this summit on. Matt Hayes in the background here, Lisa Earle, Jennifer Stinson. I'm sure there's just so many others that we could thank. We're so grateful for you. And now is the time that we all need to just move forward with our friends, with our congregations, with our associates at work, and make this a better, more welcoming place for people of all persuasions, all beliefs, and bring civility back to our country. And we're all about that here, and I hope we can be all about that when we leave here as individuals. We're going to ask Lisa Amberg to offer benediction. Yes, old Lisa, yes.
Just some business. There's a few more snacks that you can pick up on the drinks on your way out. There's also some more brochures and books. And please fill out your evaluation and leave it in the basket before you leave. Thank you.
Our Father in heaven,
We are so grateful to be gathered here, grateful for the blessings of community and for the interactions we've had. Please bless us to be peacemakers. Please bless us to do justly and love mercy and walk humbly with thee and with each other and with all of our brothers and sisters. In the name of Jesus Christ, amen.